It begins with a period of calm to build trust, and then Hamas will release hostages in batches. It is talking about releasing them 3 at a time initially. In the first stage, 33 hostages would be released. They are being described as the humanitarian cases, the hostages who are elderly, injured, sick in any way. Some of the hostages are described as being in quite poor health. If that is successful, they would move on to the next phase. And this initial phase could take 42 days. So this, Lester, is a very slow period. The next phase, if the first phase is successful, would see Hamas released all of the remaining hostages, including soldiers and military-aged males. A lot of room for this to go wrong, but certainly a historic moment that could see potentially an end to this conflict, an end to the suffering of the people in Gaza. Because in exchange for the release of these hostages over time, Israeli troops would pull back from population centers in Gaza. They would establish a buffer zone around the Gaza Strip and release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and allow much more aid into the Gaza Strip, hundreds of trucks per day. Lester.
All right, Roger, I'll ask you to stand by. Let's talk about how we got here. Correspondent Raf Sanchez, who covers the region, is joining me now. Raf, what do we know about how the pieces are coming together?
Well, Lester, this deal was finally sealed after marathon negotiations in Doha, Qatar, mediated by the prime minister of that country. And these talks have been touch and go right up until the very last minute. We started getting indications on Monday that the two sides were close. And earlier today, the cameras were up and rolling at the foreign ministry in Qatar. The Qataris preparing to announce this agreement, and then there was what appears to be a last-minute hitch. According to the Israeli government, Hamas adding last-minute demands to do with Israeli forces withdrawing from the Egypt-Gaza border. The Prime Minister of Qatar, who we are expecting to see in front of those cameras potentially any minute now, going back into his office with the delegation from Hamas and finally getting that deal over the line. What has been very notable, Brett McGurk, President Biden's most senior Middle East advisor, has been camped out in Qatar for around 10 days now, but he has been joined by Steve Witkoff, who is President-elect Trump's incoming Middle East envoy. And these two Americans representing the current administration and the incoming administration have been, according to the White House, working hand in hand, sending the message not just to Qatar, but also to Israel and Hamas that this is a bipartisan push, that any deal that is sealed under the Biden administration will be pushed forward by the Trump administration. And of course, Lester, we have heard from President-elect Trump repeatedly in recent weeks saying that if there is not a deal in place by the time of his inauguration on January 20th, there will be, in his words, hell to pay. He never spelled out exactly what those consequences were, but multiple officials say that deadline really helped focus minds, and it helped push these negotiations to the point where now, just days before that deadline, it does appear that a deal is in place. I asked Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, last month in Tel Aviv, how big a role President-elect Trump's pressure had played. He acknowledged that there was good communication between the teams. The other point he made about why is it that a deal has been able to be reached now but wasn't able to be reached before, he said the ceasefire in Lebanon, which ended the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah back in November, really brought Hamas closer to the table. It led them to a point where they concluded that they had to reach a deal. Prime Minister Netanyahu also appears to have really been feeling that pressure from President-elect Trump. He is under a lot of pressure from the far right of his own government not to end this war, but it does appear now that he has also signed on to this deal. We do expect Israel's security cabinet will have to vote to approve this agreement. Lester, the tragedy in some ways is the deal that does appear to be emerging from Qatar now does not seem to be significantly different from those broad outlines laid out by President Biden on May 31st. But a very large number of Palestinian civilians and at least some hostages have lost their lives in the months since then. Lester.
All right, Raf, we'll ask you to stand by. We're looking at the podium there in Qatar, where we expect to hear the foreign minister, the prime minister actually, will hold a news conference there. So we may get some further details on all this. In the meantime, let me go to our senior White House correspondent, Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, can you describe the flurry of activity that has led up to this?
Both in practical terms here at the White House and what you've been outlining in the many months of negotiations. As I was walking out to join you here, Lester, the activity of the press pool gathering, getting prepared. And from what I understand, it is expected that the president would release a written statement at some point and then speak to the country on this issue, separate from his planned farewell address to the nation at the end of his term that's going to happen tonight, where he would describe the sweeping accomplishments, as he would judge them, of his time in office. But this has been one of the key issues to try to bring about a resolution. And Raf was talking about Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor. We had an opportunity to speak with him in the briefing room this week, where he talked about a unified approach between the Biden administration and President-elect Trump's representatives to work together to try to get this done. Not only is there an urgent need to bring a resolution to end the fighting, to restore the families that have been torn apart by this, but in political terms and in global sort of security terms, having this resolved before a new president comes to office is in certainly the interest of both the Biden administration and the next administration when President Trump returns to power. Now, characteristic of President Trump, he does not always follow the typical protocol, so he has posted on his Truth Social that there is a deal and that an announcement is coming, and it indicates thank you. Now, he has every right to do that under free speech. President Biden is waiting for the official word to come from the ground, from the parties that are agreeing to this, and then we would expect to hear him. So two very different styles playing out over this crisis, and those differences can be significant when it comes to the style of American leadership and getting results. Both presidents, the outgoing and incoming, want to see this resolved, and so officials here have been very cautiously optimistic, and although they indicated there have been many times when they have described being close, that there were substantive changes in the negotiations in recent days. Closing of the gaps is what Jake Sullivan said publicly about this, that gave them this sense of hope in getting it done. Specifics about how it will be rolled out, obviously it's always tenuous, and things could certainly go sideways at different iterations of the execution of such a deal. But reaching an agreement after more than 460 days of open conflict, loss of life, and real tragedy is a significant breakthrough. And certainly for Joe Biden, who values the American standing in the world, having a role in trying to bring this to a conclusion is something that he will surely tout. Most importantly, trying to restore American families who have hostages, Israelis and others who have hostages, and to bring the fighting to a conclusion. Lester?
All right, Kelly, thanks. Let me bring back our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel. He's live in Jerusalem. Richard, we continue to wait now to get a little bit more of the fine points laid out for us and help us understand where this all leads and the steps and the order that will be taken. What more can you tell us?
Well, you would imagine that all of the families of the hostages tonight are extremely excited. But here in Jerusalem, there have been hostage families out protesting. They support the deal in general terms, but they don't like the way that it is supposed to be implemented. They think it is too long, it is too complicated. They would much prefer a one-and-done deal in which Hamas releases all of the hostages, the fighting stops, Israeli troops pull back, the war is over. That is not the deal, however, that is being signed. This deal is an immensely complex deal. It involves maps in which where the Israelis are supposed to pull back, on which day they're supposed to pull back, how much time they are supposed to, they're allowed to have before Hamas can have before it releases the next batch of hostages. So there are concerns here that this process, while generally welcomed, is extremely fragile. The role you mentioned that Qatar has been playing has been essential. The Qatari Prime Minister, who is also the Foreign Minister, has been deeply involved in this personally over the last several weeks, dedicating almost all of his time to trying to get this over the line. And here in Israel, there is also a sense, and Raf was talking about this earlier, that this deal could have been reached earlier, that the pressure from President-elect Trump helped get it over the line, but also many suspect here, Prime Minister Netanyahu's critics, that he was somewhat dragging his heels, that he wanted to wait until President-elect Trump was about to be inaugurated so that there would be a gift this could be a gift to the incoming president. So there are a lot of political factors here at play as well. And then one more thing, Lester, let's not forget the larger political context. What is happening now is very significant for the hostages. You can imagine the hostages don't want it to be happening this way. They want them all out tonight, and I can completely understand that. But what is also at play is the entire power dynamics in the Middle East are shifting. The map of the Middle East is being rewritten as we speak. Gaza, because of this war, has been destroyed. It will need to be rebuilt. Almost all of the people of Gaza have been displaced from their homes. You mentioned nearly 47,000 people killed, according to local officials in Gaza. But also, because of that October 7th attack and Israel's response to it, we have now seen Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is backed by Iran, more or less destroyed. So a new government in Lebanon, a new political reality in Lebanon. The government in Syria, which was also backed by Iran, has been overturned, and there is now a new rebel-led government in Syria. Now Hamas has been destroyed and has been forced to accept a deal that it did not obviously want to accept. What Hamas thought when it initially launched the October 7th attack was that it was going to destroy Israel, that it was going to bring the country to its knees. Instead, it saw tens of thousands of people in Gaza killed and ultimately forced to sign a deal in which it has to release the hostages and leave a buffer zone that Israel will control around Gaza. Gaza was sealed off before. It will be even more sealed off now because of this deal.
And Richard, we should know you're in Jerusalem. On the left-hand side of the screen, you're seeing the crowds in the street in Tel Aviv right now as the world waits details on a resolution to this hostage crisis. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that. We're expecting a news conference in Qatar from officials there shortly. But in the meantime, let me bring in Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. Jeremy, talk to us about the role of Americans and how they contributed to this deal.
Yeah, well, first of all, U.S. mediators were obviously integrally involved with their Israeli counterparts, their Qatari counterparts, and their Egyptian counterparts. But I also want to talk, Lester, about the 7 Americans who are part of these hostages that we are trying desperately to free today. 3 we believe are still alive. That's Sagi Dekel-Chen. He's a 36-year-old father of 3. There's Keith Siegel, the 65-year-old, who is one of the oldest in captivity. And there's Idan Alexander, who is an IDF soldier, is an American citizen. There's a lot of concern that these 3 Americans might be delayed until the second phase. And it's really important that they all come out together. There should be no delay on the Americans. And that's what I think Biden administration is telling their counterparts. We should also note that there are the remains of 4 murdered hostages. Those are lives that the families are waiting to be reunified with their loved ones. And that's Itai Chen, 19 years old. I spoke to his father earlier today. And there's Gad and Judy Haggai. And there's, of course, Omer Nutra, whose parents have also been very visible, active advocates for the case of the hostages. Their bodies, their remains need to be reunified with their loved ones so that they can begin the mourning process. And there are 7 Americans that we are desperately trying to get out of Gaza at this hour. Of course, there were initially 12 Americans that were taken hostage. A few were released early on, including Abigail Moridan, the 4-year-old baby girl who President Biden welcomed in the Oval Office, and her family were also relentless advocates for her and their all well-being. And then, of course, there was Hirsch Goldberg Poland, whose parents, Rachel and John, really took the case of the hostages to the world stage, speaking in every form possible at the United Nations, on Capitol Hill, with the Pope, with Arab leaders, with Muslim leaders, with Christian leaders. And they tragically learned on September 1st of this past year that their son, Hirsch, whose arm had been blown off in the October 7th attack, but survived miraculously and was living in horrific conditions inside the tunnels, that he was murdered at point blank range after terrorists first fired into his remaining hand, his remaining shoulder, and the back of his neck. And so the world has mourned with the Goldberg-Poland family. They have mourned with the families of the other hostages who have been lost, but they have also been relentlessly advocating for the release of these Americans. And the fate of these 7 Americans really remains and hangs in the balance tonight, Lester. If they do not come out immediately, it is going to be a failure of the negotiators. And this is just political will. It is a requirement that the negotiators get all 7 out. I don't think President Trump, President-elect Trump, President Biden, anyone can say it's over, it's done, there's a deal, we're finished, touchdown, game over, until all Americans are home.
And you remind us, as you describe the number of Americans, how delicate all this is in terms of how things could and will play out. And then there is the political reality, as Richard Engel was pointing out a moment ago, about the steps here down the wire leading to what we hope will be the release of hostages. Jeremy, to your knowledge, does the U.S. have any influence in the order of hostages in terms of their release?
Yes, I think a major issue has been which categories of individuals will come out during which phases. And as you said earlier, it's kind of a complicated deal. This isn't a great deal. I mean, let's just be clear. This is actually quite a bad deal because it separates the hostages into at least 2 categories, those who will be released in the first phase and those who will have to wait some 42 days until the second phase is achieved. The second phase would be achieved when IDF redeploys out of Gaza completely. The first phase is kicked off when there's a ceasefire. But for there to be this 42-day lag, as we've seen over the past 460 days, events can intervene, Lester, and that can create uncertainty, doubt. And if, for example, I'm just going to take an example, if Keith Siegel is brought home tonight, and if Sagid Dekel-Chen is brought home to his father, Jonathan, and the rest of their family, but Idan Alexander is not brought home to the Alexander family, this is not mission accomplished. In no way, shape, or form is this mission accomplished. And likewise, the remains of the Americans who will be left behind in a phase 1, there's no finishing this job until all of them are home. And I think the American mediators have been pressing the case of the Americans. They have been pressing the case even of those who have been murdered. And it's absolutely critical that we get all Americans home.
All right, Jeremy, let me ask you to stand by. I want to go back to our international correspondent, Raf Sanchez, joining us. Raf, the fact that Netanyahu is agreeing to this deal, does that suggest there is a body of opinion in Israel that it's mission accomplished in terms of military, that they have accomplished everything they wanted to do militarily against Hamas?
Yeah, Lester, Israel is a divided nation like the United States is, but the opinion polls have shown pretty consistently in recent months that a majority of Israelis are prepared to end the war in Gaza in order to free those remaining hostages, both dead and alive. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu, for a very long time, has been very resistant to that. The far right of his government has been threatening to bring his coalition down if he withdrew Israeli forces from Gaza. But it does appear now that the prime minister is prepared to at least enter into that first phase of the deal, this 7-week ceasefire in exchange for the release of those 33 hostages from the so-called humanitarian category. And as Richard was talking about, there is deep, deep concern among the families of the hostages that this ceasefire could potentially break down after that first phase, and you could end up in a situation where some of the hostages have come out, but others have not, and the fighting has resumed in Gaza, bringing more misery to those Palestinian civilians who would have, if it is only a 7-week ceasefire, a brief respite. Jeremy was talking about the American hostages. We are waiting to see at what stage of this deal they would be released. I have spent many, many hours with the families of American hostages over these last 466 days. Just to flesh out for viewers a little bit, the people that we are talking about here. Keith Siegel, 64 years old, a grandfather. He was kidnapped along with his wife, Aviva Siegel. She was released in that first deal back in Thanksgiving of 2023, more than a year ago. Husband and wife separated. She went up to the surface. She went out back into Israel and into relative safety, but forced to leave her husband behind. And she has been campaigning tirelessly every day since, trying to seek his freedom. Sagi Dekelhen, who you see on the middle of your screen there, he is 36 years old, born in Israel, but grew up partly in the greater Boston area. And Lester, on October 7th, he put his wife and his two daughters in the safe room of their home in Nir Oz. He closed the door and he went out to confront the Hamas gunmen who were swarming into their community. His wife, Avital, was 7 months pregnant on October 7th. She gave birth to their third child in December 2023. Sagi was not there for that birth. He just missed this little girl's first birthday. This is a little girl who has never met her father. And one of the things that Avital, his wife, said to me is that Sagi may not even know that his family survived October 7th. He may not know that he has a third daughter. And so that is just one of the many, many families right now hoping and praying. They have had no proof of life of Sagi since November of 2023. They've had no information since then. And their deepest, deepest wish is that some point in the coming days, they are going to see their father and husband emerge from Gaza and return safely to them. I will say, Lester, you and I covered that first ceasefire deal back in December 2023. That was in many ways a joyous occasion for the families of the hostages. It was pretty clear most of those hostages were in good shape physically, having spent some 50, 60 days in captivity. I can tell you there is a lot of concern in Israel right now about what kind of physical condition, to say nothing of psychological condition, that these hostages will be in when they emerge. And then, of course, there is just the absolutely dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. As part of this deal, we expect that there will be a surge of humanitarian aid, but there have been just agonizing stories, especially in recent weeks, with the winter setting in on the Mediterranean coast, of babies dying of hypothermia inside of Gaza, very little food, very little medicine reaching especially the northern part of the Strip, where Israeli forces have basically been laying siege to northern Gaza. So inside of the Strip right now, you're seeing on your screen Deir al-Balah, that is the center of the Gaza Strip. People are praying that this ceasefire holds and that it leads to the humanitarian aid that they so badly need. Lester.
Yeah, Raf, we continue to monitor this picture coming out of Gaza. We've also been looking at pictures in the streets of Tel Aviv, where people are standing by waiting for more confirmation of this apparent deal that would cover the release of hostages and a temporary ceasefire. Everyone wanting to know exactly how it will play out and over what sort of time period. And of course, looking for potential flies in the ointment, as we've been disappointed many times as this process has gone forward. Senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez is covering President-elect Trump in West Palm Beach. Gabe, Donald Trump already taking some credit here, posting about it on social media.
Certainly, and within the past few minutes, Lester, the president-elect has posted yet again on social media, calling this an epic ceasefire agreement and labeling his foreign policy, reiterating that he believes it is peace through strength. Again, the president-elect taking credit for this, also writing that we have achieved so much without even being in the White House. We have not yet heard from President Biden on this potential agreement so far, but the president-elect here in West Palm Beach, we understand that he is currently primarily at his golf club in Palm Beach County. But Lester, this comes after several weeks where he has been talking up his national security team, his incoming national security advisor, Mike Walls, and also his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who a source familiar with the process tells me was very involved in this process. Now, the president-elect, of course, now taking credit for this as he sees this will continue to be part of his foreign policy, that he will be involved in the Middle East, in his words, peace through strength. But again, we're still waiting to see how all this plays out and seeing if we get any further comment from the current administration in the White House, President Biden. But again, President-elect Trump calling this an epic agreement in a social media post just several minutes ago.
And Gabe, as to your point, the White House, let's go right there now. White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell has a statement been put out, Kelly.
What we are told now from officials is that President Biden will speak publicly, and that will also likely be accompanied by a written statement. But that moves this forward now that there's so much discussion in the open space about this deal having been reached. This White House likes to follow the protocol of having those on the ground reveal it first. But in talking with sources here, two different officials are saying that the deal is reached and that it's the president's intention to speak publicly about this. And with all the caveats of concerns about the nature of the fragile nature of this agreement and how difficult it was to get there. They don't want to get ahead of the process, but at this point are willing to acknowledge that the president's plan is to address this publicly. Lester?
All right, Kelly O'Donnell. And Kelly, can you talk about, has there been any comment about the order in which we could see hostages released? In other words, in terms of, will the Americans potentially come out together?
Well, certainly in the incremental conversations we have had, which were before this stage of the deal being reached as it is now, imperative on part of the American negotiators that they have a full accounting of the whereabouts, the health and the status of those American hostages and any remains of Americans. And the order, of course, is sensitive in wanting to make certain that at no point does a release trigger outside events that then hinder further release. So clearly, I don't have the specifics of exactly what the final document says, but the intentions, as we understand it from talking to officials, is that they want Americans released early and to have a full accounting of remains of Americans from this conflict.
All right. Again, left-hand side of your screen, we're seeing people gathered around flames there in Gaza, people anxiously awaiting there, as in Tel Aviv, as in and around the world, as to what this deal is, what it means, how long it will take to secure the release of all the hostages. There's a live picture from Jerusalem, I believe, about 8 o'clock at night there, as they certainly that part of the world standing by for the very latest. Let me bring back Chief Correspondent, Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel. He's live there in Jerusalem. Richard, this has been such a hard-fought battle to get this far. What are some of the potential points of late disagreement that could unravel it?
So, first of all, Lester, there are now some celebrations taking place in Gaza because this has been such an extraordinarily difficult conflict for the 2.2 million people there. And yes, there are many pitfalls, as we've all been discussing. This slow deal, the slow rollout, the many different caveats, the different stipulations of how the hostages have to be released and where Israeli troops have to pull back and how many trucks of aid are supposed to go in and which number of prisoners are supposed to be released from Israeli prisons. Hamas says now that 250 prisoners will be released with life sentences and hundreds other with lengthy sentences. There are many opportunities for this deal to not hold. There are many opportunities for Israel to accuse Hamas of breaking the deal or Hamas to accuse Israel of breaking the deal. Right now, there are these celebrations that have begun in Gaza. People are desperate to have more food, to have some reprieve, to have the ability not to fear daily bombings. There are celebrations among some of the Israeli hostages, but also great trepidation as they try and consider who's going to come out first. Will their son, will their daughter, will their mother, will their father be in the first group, be in the second group, and what kind of condition will they be in?
All right, Richard Engel, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com, and a full wrap-up when I see you for NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Thank you for watching, and good day.